Awesome. So welcome everyone. This is the next in our resiliency series. This is process resiliency, keeping everything from hitting the fan, aptly titled. A lot can go wrong when you don't have the right processes in place. I'm Skip Newberry, President and CEO of TAO, and we are joined here by Ruthie Ditzler, who's our Head of Marketing and Communications. And she'll be running the background here to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And a few sort of rules of engagement as we get started. So all participants have been muted, so please wait for a TAO staff member to call on you if you wish to speak. And we'll also encourage you during the conversation to post questions you might have in the chat channel. And then we'll select those and bring them into the conversation. And then any questions we may not get to during this session, we'd be happy to put into our online member engagement platform, which is called Mobilize. And we can continue the conversation there. And we also encourage you to follow us on social media. So feel free to take a screenshot of us during our conversation. And if you want to share that over social media, either during the event or after, please feel free, and you'll definitely get a reshare from us. And then also, if you're interested in learning about Mobilize, which is the online member engagement platform, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we'll help get you set up. And then also we have, if you're interested in membership in TAO, you can always email us at membership@techoregon.org. So that's about it in terms of run of show. We're really pleased to have Catalyte, which is a member company of TAO's that has been a huge supporter of the local tech ecosystem. As that company has been growing, so has our tech ecosystem. And Catalyte's been along there helping to support as the Oregon ecosystem continues to expand. They're doing some really cool stuff. If you haven't checked them out already, you should, especially around companies' talent needs. They are doing some really cool cutting edge stuff, both in terms of their product offering and also the types of talent that they have. It's an interesting company for sure. And I was on a call last week where it turns out the CTO of one of our startup member companies was the first CTO at Catalyte back in the day when the company got started. So you never know, it's a small world. There are a myriad number of connections between Oregon and other parts of the country. So we're really pleased to have with us today, Paige and David. So Paige is a program manager at Catalyte, and David's the VP of marketing, or sorry, VP and managing director for Catalyte here in the Oregon office. And what's really fantastic is that going from a session last week on technical resiliency, we're now into the process, the glue that keeps it all going and keeps it all together. And we have a number of questions we'll be going through today. But first, I wanted to provide an opportunity for both Paige and David to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their respective backgrounds. And then from there, we can get into some moderated questions. We'll likely have some time for some audience Q&A at the end. And so if folks want to kind of pop back on in terms of their video at the end, I'll signal for that. But in the meantime, if you have questions as we're talking, feel free to shoot those into the chat channel. So Paige, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Sure. Glad to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm Paige Hines Cheatham, and I am a program manager at Catalyte. I manage one of our largest customers with over 100 folks on the program. I've been with Catalyte for a little over 2.5 years. But before Catalyte, I spent most of my career in the federal government space, where I was a federal contractor for large organizations such as General Dynamics, SAIC, and Lockheed Martin. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. And David?
Sure. So yeah, thanks again, Skip and Ruthie and the rest of TAO for hosting this. I think it's great material to deliver to the community, and always, these things always have great discussion. So excited to be a little bit more in the driver's seat in terms of being a panelist and not just a participant today. But yeah, my name is David Bernal, VP and Managing Director for Catalyte. Specifically for our Portland office and our West Coast operations. So yeah, I essentially run operations for Portland. I've been with Catalyte for coming up on 9 years, which makes me very much an old timer around here. And as Catalyte was growing from a company of roughly 40 people when I joined to more than 700 today, I was working to engineer a lot of our internal processes around how we do interviewing and hiring and onboarding, and then in building our program management office, our processes around, execution, around building enterprise software and, ensuring client satisfaction and all the things that go into delivering to clients as a services company. So as Paige knows very well, process is something very near and dear to my heart. And I come from a kind of overall philosophy, that process should be enabling and not encumbering. So yeah, excited to be here to talk with you today about process resiliency.
Awesome. And so just as some context before we get into the Q&A, we're all in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And over the last few months, a lot of organizations have had their processes that are already in place get tested by the crisis. And they found that sometimes those processes haven't been able to adapt and withstand and be resilient to a crisis such as COVID-19. And so companies are starting to kind of reevaluate and reassess and figure out what are the processes that are going to be most resilient across a number of different potential crises, which are the ones that are going to scale with them as an organization over time. And then also some companies and organizations have figured out that, in being hit with the crisis, that maybe they need to implement some new processes as well. And so what's great is between Paige and David, they have a lot of experience in terms of what processes work and don't. And so we'll be going through some questions to hopefully provide you all with some takeaways that will be illustrative and hopefully helpful in your own practice as you go back and see if you can implement some of what we've talked about today. So as we get started here, I wanted to focus a little bit on definitions. So, process resiliency is not something that you hear very often, depending on your job title or function. And so I wanted to start maybe with Paige and say, what does process resiliency mean to you?
To me, process resilience means having effective, proven, and repeatable processes in place that allows an organization to adapt and bend to circumstances. Organizations must reevaluate their processes constantly and seek new and better ways to conduct business. They need to be more agile when it comes to their processes, so they are more flexible, more durable, and more responsive to change. You can't just implement a process and leave it there because it'll become stagnant. So you have to constantly reassess and implement improvements over time. Let me give you an example. In the midst of COVID-19 crisis, one of our competitors encountered a ransomware breach, and we had nothing to do with it. But our customer asked us to scale and onboard 30 new resources ASAP. Now, this was great for the company, but it was hectic for the folks that had to onboard these individuals so quickly. But if we didn't have the proper processes and procedures in place, there would be no way that we could adapt and scale so quickly. We were able to do it seamlessly because we were prepared, and this change came along and we were ready. And that's what organizations have to do, right? They have to stay ready.
Excellent. David, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with Paige. Other thing, the main thing I would say for process resiliency to me is that, you have to have processes that will bend but won't break, right? So, if unexpected circumstances come up or, something in kind of the pathway of a process getting complete, there's an obstacle there. Process resiliency means you bend but don't break. You can still get the thing done, right? Whatever the thing is. So yeah, thinking of the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of organizations have seen struggles with that, right? And have struggled on how do we continue to deliver the flow of value to our customers or the flow of value to our stakeholders. What bottlenecks do we have in our own processes that are being exposed, by the fact that people can't do business face to face, or people can't come into an office and collaborate. So it's about finding those constraints, finding those bottlenecks, making sure there aren't single points of failure, or if there are, that you have, good contingencies in place if something should come up to disrupt your normal process and expose those points of failure. And so when I think about it, I think of just, again, the things we've seen with the pandemic, and there have been some real obvious kind of winners and losers, right? And then there have been some also pretty obvious things where organizations have scrambled to react and to kind of shore up their processes and turn them into success, right? Realize that in the crisis there was opportunity. So some examples that come to mind for me, right? If you think of a lot of our kind of administrative government organizations, right? Did not have great process resiliency. If you're the DMV and part of, being able to do renewals and registrations and license plates and all of that, which, by the way, is where your revenue comes from. If it requires people going to a building and standing and sitting together and waiting in line and doing business face to face with, paper documentation, that's not very resilient. Whereas, you'll get grocery businesses, right? Amazon has been thriving during the pandemic, but even locally here in Portland, you've seen what Fred Meyer has done. So Fred Meyer needs to deliver groceries to customers to make revenue. With the pandemic, that was challenged, but they were able to pretty quickly pivot and leverage some of their existing technology and process and adapt it and shift to a model where they were delivering, right, to people locally, giving them an alternative to just, Amazon same day delivery, for groceries and things like that. And so they were resilient enough to be able to pivot in the crisis. And that's, great for them, but there's a lot of organizations that weren't, right? And we see that with, the restaurant businesses in Portland. We see that with a lot of other businesses that have struggled when part of their process of realizing revenue has been disrupted.
Great.
And I agree with David, especially with a lot of the government agencies. My husband works for Department of Defense, and he deals with classified information. So he has literally been home since March. They didn't have the infrastructure in place, so he may do training like maybe once a week or so. So it's scary to think, but the government wasn't ready for this.
That is a little frightening.
It is.
But yes, no, it's also interesting too. You mentioned some of the the training that they're now providing and trying to like course correct in real time. This is a little bit, kind of down a tangent, but I'm wondering, how important is it that organizations have essentially the ability to adapt in terms of professional development, and is that part of a larger sort of process resilience plan, is being able to quickly, get the just-in-time training that they need?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Oh, sorry, Paige, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was say absolutely, right? So yeah, process weaves its way through every part of the organization, right? So, process for training is no different. And again, if you're accustomed to having, a process for training where people have to have face-to-face contact or have to be, together in classrooms, that's going to be problematic on a number of fronts, right? If all of a sudden that's gone, you're looking at what are kind of all of the processes within that activity, right? So, in the nature of training, there's the content delivery, there's the validation that the, knowledge has been absorbed or can be applied. And then there's the student's process of learning, right? Which, sometimes relies on in-person discussion or, feedback or, even just thinking of, collaboration and group projects and things like that if you're in, a higher education kind of setting. So all of those things are being highly disrupted as well, right? And we see educational institutions struggling with it. We've seen, Harvard and University of Southern California and some other universities, announce that everything's going to be virtual in the fall. But how are they going to adapt to that, right? How are they going to make it so that the quality of the education isn't diminished and so that their students' experience, being educated and learning, isn't diminished as a result of that. And some of those things, have answers that are more easy to apply. The idea of video conferencing and collaboration tools and things like that can simulate some of that discussion and being together. But other pieces of it just can't be replicated, right? You think of a chemistry class or biology class. There's no way, reasonably to do chemistry lab in your home, right? In your garage, in your basement. It's going to be difficult for you, to dissect an animal, right, at home, probably for most people, and understand what you're doing and get real-time feedback from a professor. So, yeah, those things are very difficult to deal with. And I think that's part of what's happening just in general, right, in the country and in the world right now, is a lot of folks trying to figure out, how do you solve for that? Because some of the answers are easy, and some of them are hard but achievable, and some of them have yet to emerge. So there's a lot of challenge around that right now.
So Paige, I wanted to ask you, like, is there like a such a thing as a new normal?
That's a good question. Like the old saying goes, the only constant in life is change. So to me, it's not a new normal, it's the next normal. The idea of constant change or not having a new normal frightens some people. But again, organizations have to adapt and pivot on the fly and constantly find new ways to predict and prepare for change. I look at it like comparing small steps or increments than having to climb over a wall, every couple of years. If you are able to build resilience into your organization, then constant iterations will move you forward. A great example to me is Facebook. When I first joined Facebook, it looked one way, but now it's totally different. And Facebook makes small and constant improvements on a regular basis, and that's what organizations need to do.
David, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we're finding out, right? Is there such a thing as a new normal? Surely there will be. As the crisis eventually gets resolved, right, we're going to see what that new normal looks like. For some things, the pendulum may be swinging too far and it'll have to swing back a little bit. But some things are clearly here to stay, right? So, just thinking about how it affects, different processes, right? You look at the processes around public schools or learning, or, the shift to remote, and how organizations are now having to get really good at, remote onboarding and remote management, and some of the things that go with that. That new normal is evolving right now, right? It hasn't stabilized. So we're not sure what it's going to be, but, I think for all of us, if we were to look back at, February and say, if you told yourself in February what the world was going to look like today at the end of July, no one would believe you, right? They'd think you're a crazy person. But what we're seeing, right, is some of those things are trending and are going to stay, right? The trending towards remote work isn't going anywhere, because companies are realizing that not only is, co-location in a lot of instances not absolutely mandatory, but that it's actually costly. We have clients who have shut down offices permanently, not because they're laying the people off, but they looked at what happened and they enabled them to work remotely, and they had concerns about productivity, but actually saw the opposite happen. Saw that productivity went up. And so we have, clients, one large insurance company in particular that comes to mind, where they're actually shutting down like a whole office tower in one of the cities they operate in. It was a lot of, call center people and customer support people and remote administration people. And, they're seeing that they're actually more productive at home than they are in the office. And they're saying, well, wow, if we, let them work from home, the employees are happier, they're more productive, we're getting more work done, and we're letting go of all of the costs of having an office, and, everything from the rent to the utilities to the snacks to, the support staff that have to be there to clean it and take care of it and maintain it, to the insurance they carry. they can let all of those things go and just shift a tiny portion of that budget into enabling, better remote work, making sure people have the right, telephone system and ergonomic desk and, whatever they need to be successful at home. And so things like that aren't coming back. And we're also seeing, in terms of process, we're seeing that there's a lot of things that can be accomplished remotely that folks maybe weren't sure could be, or we're adapting processes to make sure things can happen, with remote folks as opposed to people on site. So all of that is really revealing, right? It's showing us, what's possible. It's revealing what's really critical in a process, and what might have been maybe a social construct or a social norm that people were clinging to that wasn't necessarily essential to the process of getting something done. So we're all on the we're all in the dark, kind of driving through the tunnel together. And I think there will be a new normal, but I think it's still very much emergent right now.
So I want to spend a little bit of time exploring this tension that both of you have kind of illuminated, right? Because on the one hand, you've got sort of the need for some baselines, some processes that bend and adapt but don't break. But on the other hand, there's also this really dynamic environment we find ourselves in with a lot of change. And so how much flexibility do you have before it becomes complete chaos? And so when you're deciding on a process baseline, how do you define the baseline? Okay, this is where it gets rigid and we're not going to bend beyond this point. And then how do you look at then where certain areas allow for some of the bending and the flexibility? It's a tough question. It's more of a sort of an observation at this point, but I wanted to see if either of you wanted to kind of explore a little bit further how you define a process such that it's flexible, but has some clearly defined baselines. So it's here's the things that are inviolable. We're not going to change these, but then how do you determine what the rest is that you can kind of let go or be flexible?
Paige, you want to take that one, or you want me to hop in?
So what I think you're asking is how much process do you need in order to stay flexible, and then how much process can become too rigid?
Yep.
So it goes back to what I said earlier. You have to have effective processes in place, but then you also have to prepare for change and adapt on the fly with no visibility of what's going to happen in the future. So I think organizations should continuously find new ways to predict and prepare for change. A lot of times, companies can do scenario planning or anticipate to avoid. So they do pre-planning, maybe a pre-planning meeting, and try to figure out all the things that could happen and then try to prepare for that.
I love it. For a recovering attorney, it's kind of prepare for the worst in every scenario.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think about it too in terms, always through the lens of software development, because that's what we do. But, when you're thinking about where you can bend and where you have to be rigid, there's some clear markers there and there's some fuzzier ones. So some of the clear ones are around things like, regulatory compliance. So we have clients that are in financial services or in healthcare, and they can bend the way they do things, but they have to absolutely make sure they're still owning and protecting and securing their user data, whether that's healthcare data in their space or, people's financial data and credentials and passwords and things like that on the financial side. You have to kind of figure out for yourself, for your organization, for your business, what are the things that are absolutely non-negotiable and you can't risk and are untouchable. But I think after that, you need to figure out what things are malleable and empower your people to play in that space, right? Empower the people close to the work to figure it out. Part of process resiliency is having the individual processes be resilient, but another part of it is being flexible and adaptable and agile in your approach to figuring out new solutions to old problems, or figuring out how to continue, to deliver, and how to continue to execute your value streams without, locking people into something that's going to be encumbering or create extra work. So I think a big part of it is embracing the idea of change, again, empowering people, recognizing and focusing on constraints, right? So like everything's changed with COVID. What are our new constraints? They're mostly about, face-to-face interaction and travel. So, okay, what problems does that create? How can we creatively try to solve those problems? Do we have any ideas or hypotheses we want to test? How are we going to evaluate whether we're successful? Lean manufacturing gives a framework for that. Agile gives a framework for that, for iterating. And I think that's a big part of it, right? Is saying, okay, here are the things that we can't move. Here are the things that we possibly can move, but also how are we going to measure the effect, right? So when you talked about baseline earlier, Skip, it's the idea of what is the baseline for your process or what you're doing. Is it, production? Is it number of widgets made per hour? Is it the amount of, code delivered in a sprint? Is it client satisfaction with, your delivery or your service? What are kind of the numbers out there that you can baseline? And then as you kind of, tweak things in the process or change things, observe how that data changes, observe how the outcomes change. And as long as I think you have, the group of people experimenting, have all of that in mind, right? They understand the things that can't be affected. They understand their constraints. You kind of give them the clear, sandbox to play in and rules of the game, and give them data, so that they have instant feedback or close to instant feedback. People are going to figure it out. The people who are closest to the work are always going to have, the best perspective on how to make it better, how to enable their success, how to enable their efficiency. So I think that's something that's really important right now, especially for large organizations, is to empower the boots on the ground, so to speak, to have a say and to have a stake in figuring out, the new world, and figuring out how to change up your processes to enable the larger picture success of the org.
Excellent. So scenario planning is definitely one tactical thing that can be done to kind of look at what are some of the worst case scenarios and how do you plan for them. In terms of what processes you already have in place, what do you both recommend when it comes to stress testing? Like, how frequently should it occur? What are some best practices in terms of kind of like testing some of the existing processes that are already in place?
Paige?
You can go ahead. You can go first.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think, again, thinking about it first, I guess, in the narrow lens of software development, which is again where, I'm skewed towards, for us, stress testing should happen constantly, really. I mean, stress testing for any kind of software application, backend platform or system is something that should be frequent and ongoing and just part of how you normally do business. Yeah, there's lots of, mechanisms to do that from a software perspective in terms of just hammering the software from different angles, right? Creating scenarios where, a data center fails, creating scenarios where you suddenly have a giant spike, in active users, or, a bunch of people trying to buy something at once, and, can the site stand up and handle it? Can your, payment system handle it? Can your processing handle it? Can your fulfillment handle it? All of those different things. But for other organizations, I think the stress testing is a little bit different, right? So we've seen in COVID, stress is coming from different places. We've seen, I was talking to a buddy of mine this morning who works for a medical manufacturing company, and they're getting stress tested every which way around COVID testing. They're one of the companies that's creating new tests. And with the spike in cases, they're getting crazy increased demand from all of their customers of like, hey, I know we said we needed 20,000 a week last week. Now we need 40,000 a week because cases are spiking in Southern California, and we anticipate this being a thing. And so, for them, they're just trying to keep their heads above water. But he was talking about how stressful that is, where they just upped their manufacturing capacity to meet the demand that was there 3 weeks ago. And now, the demand that's being asked for is, 1.75x or something, so they felt like they were just getting their head above water, and now they're getting beaten up again. But I think that scenario planning, that was mentioned is a huge part of that, just trying to look ahead and say, okay, what do we know about our current situation? What are the variables that may change on us? And then if they do, right, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to respond? What is our contingency plan? What risks may surface. I think risk management is another big part of that. We talked about scenario planning, but risk management, thinking about, what if our supply chain is interrupted? What if our workforce, has its own outbreak, like the Florida Marlins, right? What do we do now? And Major League Baseball is certainly being stress tested right now. Like, oh, we had this plan we put together for months, and in a week, it's already kind of blown up. So you've got to do that risk management, thinking about potential negative risks, but also taking advantage of positive risks, right? Whether, is there a risk of something that could create opportunity for us? Amazon is certainly crushing it with that, obviously, right now. If you've been, watching kind of their performance and earnings and stock price and all of that good stuff. So the risk management, the scenario planning, and contingency planning, I think, is a big part of it. And yeah, just doing your best, right, to see around the corner, what might be coming at you. How are you going to respond? And also, again, just planning for those things. What's the likelihood? What's the impact? And if this happens, what are we going to do about it? And then I think part of it too is just trying not to panic, right? So everyone's business is being hit in different ways right now. And we know, that part of what's coming at us is there's going to be things that are unexpected. So when they happen, I think it's important for folks to keep a level head, and be really solution oriented about, how to get through the next constraint, through the next roadblock, or take advantage of the next opportunity, rather than letting it kind of devolve into chaos, right, disorganization or panic or things like that.
Paige, anything you want to add?
I agree with David in reference to risk management. I also think that when you're stress testing processes, lessons learned is the best teacher also. So you have to look at your processes, ask the tough questions, identify any type of confusion or inefficiencies or weaknesses within your processes, and then make improvements. So you should develop a plan of action for how this will be achieved. And then you need to audit what is currently taking place and where your strengths and weaknesses lie.
So in terms of different sizes of organizations, I think, how much does this process resilience really change if you're talking about, say, a small organization, medium, or large? And are there certain things that are kind of basic that you could normalize across all three sizes of organization? And then what are the things that are a little bit different?
I think it's the same foundation for any size business. Organizations must take steps to proactively standardize their processes. If these processes are not already in place, then they need to create a baseline to quantify and measure improvements. But I also think that communication and transparency is key. These elements help to build the trust that you need to normalize these new practices. Another thing is organizations have to be open, fully honest, and fully transparent. And then also they need to bring people into the process as early as possible, because once you get folks invested, they're more inclined to participate. So you also have to give people ownership and responsibility for the change. And another key point is to get buy-in from leadership. I think that's key because it starts from the top.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. When you talk about things that are the same across any size organization, totally agree with Paige. I think in any size organization, you have to focus again on constraints and friction points in the processes. Where are there handoffs that are going to be thrown off? where there are going to be new constraints that we need to get people focused on and how we mitigate them or get our way around them. That's going to be consistent across any size organization. Being honest, being open, being transparent is going to be, I think applies to any size organization. Also, I think the concept of nurturing, the conversation and collaboration internally, facilitating conversation and collaboration, what in the way we do business is, at risk, what is going to fail, what do people see at different kind of levels of the organization, right? What concerns do you have or insights do you have as someone, working boots on the ground versus, middle management versus, senior management or even the C-suite. Having facilitated conversations across kind of those strata, those layers of the organization, I think is important in any size org. I think something else that's important in any size organization is just the idea of practicing gratitude, right? Of understanding that as you're reworking any process in the business, it's going to cause problems, right? For folks, it's going to cause, anxiety, it's going to cause stress. Some people may suddenly have new things dumped in their lap. Some people may have, their cozy routine that they're, very accustomed to disrupted, and that can affect them emotionally, as well as just in terms of their actual work. So, you've got to recognize that folks are in uncharted waters, that, they're working together to try to fix things and make sure that, things aren't broken and value is still being delivered by the business. And you just need to practice gratitude, let people know that you empathize with the situation they're in, that you're looking for their ideas, that you're grateful for their efforts and grateful for their ideas. And doing that helps just kind of put people at ease and also brings out the best in them, I think, a lot of the time, when they're having to be creative or when they're working under stress. One more thing that occurred to me, that applies to any organization, I think, is just measuring outcomes, right? Measuring results. And it seems pretty obvious, but I'm continuously surprised by, how many folks don't necessarily do this. They think that the outcome will be apparent or the result will be apparent, or, they can just look at it subjectively and be like, oh, well, I feel like we had less customer complaints last week than this week, so I think it must be working. Getting down to actual data, right? What kind of indicators can you identify? Can you baseline? Can you tie, when the needle moves, can you tie it to an action you took or didn't take? And just evaluate that information over time and let the data speak to whether your process change is working. All those things, I think, are consistent across any size org. And then when it comes to things that maybe aren't consistent, I think small orgs, it's relatively easy, right? A small enough org, you can have a conversation, you can move forward, you can check in with people and make sure, whatever change is implemented is working. Medium-sized orgs, maybe more layers of management and things like that. You have to be a lot more cognizant of having crisp communication, of measuring the impacts at different layers of the organization, or at different departments, if you will. And you really have to put energy into establishing and cultivating feedback loops. So how, if we're looking at changing something, how are we going to make sure that we're hearing the different voices of the people affected? We're hearing the voice of the worker and the manager and the customer, so that we know if what we're doing is working or not, or are we inadvertently creating new problems by trying to solve the one that's right in front of our face. I think lastly, for large organizations, if you're changing processes in large organizations, a lot of times it does require some kind of formal change management plan. I think you also, in a lot of those large organizations, when you're faced with adversity and challenges to your process, you need to make room for that, kind of decentralized decision making, right? So again, the idea of trusting people closer to the work, trusting people closer to the customer, to make some calls, and trusting them to, do experiments, trusting them to, speak up, and making sure they understand that feedback will not only be heard, but will be taken into account, if the larger organization has to make a call on something. So, when you give people a voice, I think, particularly in larger organizations, they're much more willing to come on board with new practices or processes, or come on board with changes, if they have the voice. And even more so if it's their idea, right? If they have an idea for a change and you entertain it and you celebrate it, if it's a success, you're going to reinforce those feedback loops and reinforce people contributing to the solution over time.
I think both Paige and David, you've made some really astute observations in terms of like the internal need for transparency, and people are generally human nature resistant to constant change, right? So how do you kind of provide them with the communication channels they need to assuage some of those concerns? I'm wondering is you think about like external, like so with process resilience and how you communicate that to customers where you're changing something. Do the same sort of principles and practices apply as you would apply it to a customer as you would internally, or are there some distinctions?
I think there are certainly some distinctions. I mean, some of them apply certainly, right? Customers love to have a voice. I mean, that applies very much in software, obviously. There's a lot of vocal end users and customers out there in any kind of software application, and they'll tell you, what they want and what they need. And if you're paying attention to that information, they will do a lot of your product management for you. Honestly, if they're telling you what they want, if they're telling you what they want to pay for, go ahead and build it for them and allow them to give you, their money or to give you their, loyalty and traffic or however your business works to generate revenue. For other organizations, it can be tougher though, right? For some business models, it can be really hard to always be able to hear the voice of the customer, just depending on scale, right? So I think about, Amazon is a good example. When all of this hit, there was a lot of irritation, with Amazon, but with a lot of their customers, because they were missing dates, right? Like people become so accustomed to the privilege of, Amazon Prime delivery, the idea that I can pick up almost anything I want and have it here next day or in 2 days. And especially earlier in the pandemic, those things were blown out the window, right? And Amazon systems weren't even accurately reflecting reality to their customers. So that was creating more, kind of chafing with the customer, right? They were saying, oh yeah, you're going to get it in 2 days. And then 2 days later, they'd say, oh, sorry, we meant 4 days. Whereas if you were able to tell them right out of the gate, it was going to be 4 days, you set the expectation, you meet it, people are generally understanding. But when you set an improper expectation with the customer and you miss it, then they're going to be really upset. So yeah, when you're changing things up with customers and you have to, look for ways to understand their experience or get their feedback. I think it depends a lot on the scale of the organization and the level of personal interaction. For us as a services company, right, our interactions with our clients are very high fidelity, right? We meet with them regularly. We speak with them, was face-to-face. Now it's a lot of video conferencing, but, you have this two-way conversation, weekly or as frequently as you need, and you get all of the feedback around what they're struggling with, what they're noticing, if they have any concerns, that kind of stuff. Obviously you don't get that with a lot of other businesses. And so it's hard to know without having a really specific plan, how they're being affected by changes in process or how they're being affected by things you're asking them to do differently, as a result of the shifting situation. Are you asking them to be more patient? Are you asking them to, come pick up their package at the door after the delivery person has left rather than interacting with them face to face? Are you having to communicate with them differently around, timing or around accuracy of orders even? I mean, that's something in grocery shopping we've experienced is when you have these shoppers at Fred Meyer, let's say, picking something up for you. What if they make a substitution? Is it the right substitution? Are you going to be happy with it or not? If you're not, what can you do about that? Can you get a refund? Can they make it right? So yeah, anytime you introduce change to that transaction, right? Change to the transaction of I deliver some kind of value and you are happy with the delivered value. There's opportunity in there to mess it up. But there's also opportunity to get it right and to delight people. So, you just need to make sure that you are open to hearing feedback, from your customers or from your clients, and that you're, again, willing to action it and refine it over time.
And Paige, I'm wondering, as we think about like the process of change and how can individual employees become change agents within their respective organizations, how would you recommend someone go about becoming a change agent that's effective, either with a project or within their company as a whole?
I think that, well, first of all, no one likes change. So, I mean, as a change agent, we have to be able to motivate and inspire and catalyze the change process in hopes of a positive outcome. We have to get people excited about the change. Change doesn't always have to be a negative thing. So, you know, we need to get buy-in from leadership. David had mentioned it before, process ownership. So others, especially the folks that will use these processes, feel like they're part of the solution. And so organizations, I think, have to embrace change as part of their company culture.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think, you know, thinking about change agents, you know, a lot of process leaders in organizations are deep in the weeds and have unrivaled visibility, you know, I would say, with what their processes mean in terms of the impact to their teams around them, their impact to their customers or their clients. And so, you know, they're in a great place to be an effective change agent. To be an effective change agent, you have to have credibility both directions, you know, upstream and downstream. You have to have credibility with, you know, the bigger picture leadership of the organization, and you have to have credibility with the people who are, you know, kind of feeling the consequence of whatever the changes that you're implementing. So because of that, right, to be an effective change agent as a process leader, you need to, you know, be aware of everything that's happening. You need to make observations around any changes and, you know, what they mean for the rest of the process, where they realize efficiency gains, where they, you know, gum up the works. You need to be somebody who can, you know, tweak and experiment a little bit. And again, I think measuring results is a huge part of it. If you want to be a change agent, you know, it's anybody can have an idea, but to be able to take it from just I have an idea for change to I have a proposal for change, and here's what I think is going to happen, and here's how we're going to measure whether it was successful or not, or whether it had the intended outcome or not. That's a big leap in terms of being able to be effective. Effective change agents need to be evangelists. I think they need to be able to, you know, speak to others and engage with skeptics and, you know, kind of pull people along, right? Get everyone rowing in the same direction. Yeah, if you can do that, right, I think results speak for themselves. So, you know, if you're trying to be a change agent and you're a process leader, you know, you need to be able to, again, quantify those results or measure them in some way. And then share them, right? Share those good ideas, share the results, you know, explain why they were a good idea and how you've proven that they were a good idea. And then, yeah, just celebrate the wins, right? Again, if you're being an effective change agent, and part of that is facilitating the change and listening to people and, you know, giving audience for their ideas and being willing to experiment with other people's ideas. You know, when you celebrate when those are successful, you're not only reinforcing the change in process that's going to be good for the business, but you're reinforcing the bigger picture kind of culture of you know, again, decentralizing decision making, allowing teams to have voices, allowing people, you know, who are close to the work to express what good process will look like or better process will look like. And what that's going to do is just encourage others to think that way and encourage others to act that way and bring ideas to the table. Which, you know, can create a snowball effect and really get everyone thinking about how can we iterate, how can we get better, and if I discover something I think is a worthwhile change, how can I, you know, evangelize it and help all of us get better at what we do.
Paige, just building on that, you know, part of the measuring in terms of how something either succeeded or not, you can actually measure the outcome of the project. Was it delivered on time? Was it not? You know, did it generate the revenue we hoped for? Did it not? But I'm wondering how important is also having this engagement where you're doing like sentiment analysis and, you know, also connecting with people and saying, okay, how did this make you feel? Or like, you know, how did this work? Was it an improvement? Or is that also an important part of like how an organization measures whether, you know, a process has worked or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are you asking how do we know if the changes worked or were successful?
Yeah, if it's successful, but also it speaks to like a larger question of like, how do you really institutionalize process change?
I think that with process change, first of all, you have to acknowledge and understand that a change is needed. You also need to communicate the need and then develop and implement the change. And then, like David had mentioned, evaluate progress, and you should have some type of success factors in order to measure whether or not those changes were successful.
Excellent. And I'm wondering too, like, do you have some thoughts around like, how do you ensure that people don't like return to their old ways, right? So like, great, the project was completed with this new process. Now I'm gonna go back to my old way of doing things.
Um, Ongoing reinforcement. You need management commitment, and we've mentioned this before, but you need to involve people from the very beginning. This reduces resistance and rejection, but management has to have buy-in, and the change should be done quickly, and it should be decisive, sorry. And then also you have to sell the benefits, right? Explain how these changes will help the organization or will help their work, and set a final date. The transition should be fast, quick, and easy, and then again, provide some type of feedback loop. So to allow users to either voice their praises or concerns. And lastly, you should incentivize, reward, and motivate folks to make the change. So those are some things that you can do to kind of reinforce those changes.
Excellent. David, anything you want to add? Different thoughts?
Yeah, sure. No, that was a great answer from Paige. The other thing I'd think about making sure they don't return to their old ways. For me, I think a big part of that is enablement. So just the idea of if you're making a change, how do you enable folks to successfully adopt that change and move in the direction you want them to move. So sometimes that's communications campaigns. Sometimes it's creating job aids. But whatever else you need to do to say, okay, on Monday we're doing something differently, and here's all of the resources to enable you to do it differently and do it successfully. And oh, by the way, we're changing it on Monday. On Friday, we want to hear what you think about it. We want to hear, what went well, what didn't go well, how do we need to tweak it, how can we make it better? Asking for that feedback again, and then doing something with it, sets people up to kind of be on your side instead of digging in their heels. And to get their buy-in, right? Knowing they have a voice, knowing you're trying to do what you can to make them successful, helps with buy-in, and buy-in goes a hugely long way in any change that you're trying to implement. The other thing, I'd go back to again is just transparency, right? So if you're trying to get people from going back to their old ways, transparency helps, right? Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to shift the needle on something. Okay, we're trying to shift the needle. What's the gauge? What's the target? And how are we going to see how we're doing? And how are we going to let people know how their day-to-day, behavior or work, is helping shift that needle, helping move that needle or not? Being transparent with the data about how we're evaluating whether this is successful and what's important to us, and then being able to update folks along the way. Goes a huge way. Again, let them know the rules of the game, let them know how score is going to be kept, and what they're playing for. And for some folks, right now, especially what they're playing for is survival, right? There are businesses right now where if they're not shifting their process or changing things about their business, they're not going to make it. So, making sure the appropriate amount of urgency is communicated and understood. And then, just getting people to align behind those goals and showing them how they're doing along the way, and getting their feedback. I think that's the best way to try to make sure that they, remain in the new patterns or adjust to the ongoing cycle of iteration and change that's going to be required, in the environment we're in right now.
I think it was an interesting point where, thinking about like leaders or managers will often say like, hey, it's great that you're flagging a problem that exists, but even better if you're able to also offer some constructive solutions that might work. But the flip side applies too. I mean, both of you pointed out like, it's tough to ask someone to change completely the way that they've been going about their job without also being prepared to say, and here are some resources that I've thought of already that might help you in this journey. And so I think that's an interesting comment that both of you really emphasized around how do you build trust with the people you're asking to change. I'm wondering, are there certain things, as we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so if there's one takeaway that you'd love to leave sort of folks with as they're thinking about their process resilience journey, what would that be?
For me, it would be focused on the outcomes. Change can be messy. Changing processes that were working, or have been working and have been part of people's routine for a long time, can be really messy. But as long as you have, desired outcomes that are measurable, and you focus on those, and you're transparent about the progress towards getting there, I think that's the main thing that's going to get you, alignment and ultimately progress.
And I would say just having flexibility and flexible to change, because during the pandemic, what we're seeing is there's a lot of organizations that they weren't able to make that pivot, so they kind of got left behind, and their businesses are not doing well right now. So I think that organizations have to find ways to adapt to the change, and then make that pivot, and constantly try to find new ways of how they can conduct business. I look at some of the restaurants near my house, and a lot of restaurants were affected during the pandemic, and there's some restaurants that were able to shift and make the change, and then there were others that could not. For instance, there's a restaurant right beside me called Gourmet Girls, and they were takeout and dine-in only. So what they did was they just got some simple chairs, some simple tables, and some umbrellas. And now, they're in their parking lot, and they now cater to outdoor dining as well. So you have to, as an organization, make the shift and pivot, and just constantly try to find ways of doing business.
Well said. I think that's a great way to kind of bring us home and conclude our discussion today. So I want to say thanks again to Catalyte as an organization, but especially to Paige and David for taking time out of their busy schedules to spend some time and share their insight with us today. Speaking from anecdotal experience, this is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of our members, and will continue to be so as they're trying to navigate all the fluctuations of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as a multitude of other crises that have befallen us in 2020. So process is going to help see you through and your organization through, and I think that's an important takeaway today. Can't be overlooked. So thank you all for spending some time with us today, and we'll have this available recorded in our YouTube channel as well, which we'll be promoting over the next couple of weeks. And thanks again, everyone, and thank you to Ruthie for making sure everything went super smoothly on the back end of this. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you, Skip. Thank you.